And good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy to be here on a beautiful day in Colorado. We had a really nice rainstorm last night. Everything is nice and fresh. The smoke from California and Oregon has cleared out. It's going to be a wonderful Friday and a beautiful weekend. And I'm here today with my good friend Shawn Stevens from the Food Industry Council. How are you doing this morning, Shawn?
Bryan, I am fabulous. How are you?
Good. Couldn't be better too, right? The dog slept through the night. He's been out and done his business. All is well with the world.
That is great. And happy Friday.
Absolutely. So everybody, one of the things that we like to do with this is do a check-in with everybody, get all settled in, and let us know where you're from. I'm in Loveland, Colorado, which is a little north of the Denver metro area. Where in the world are you at, Shawn?
I'm located we're based in Milwaukee, but mostly working out of home these days from a small town called Random Lake, Wisconsin. I like to joke it was named after the French explorer Jacques Random, but I think they just couldn't come up with the name quick enough on the spot, so they said, let's call it Random Lake. We have about 1,500 people, quick jog to Milwaukee, but it's really nice being a small town and knowing the folks who are working behind the counter at the local stores.
Definitely. Yeah, the small town thing. Yeah, Loveland, we moved up from the Denver metro area about 5 years ago. And I was down there yesterday for a lunch meeting. And yeah, you go back to the kind of the big city with all the traffic and everything. And you're like, okay, yeah, I remember why I moved up here.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful day in Wisconsin as well. So it's looking to be a wonderful weekend.
Yep. So for the new people that are joining the conversation here, I'll give you a little bit of who I am, and then Shawn, if you can kind of jump in afterwards too. So I'm Bryan Armentrout. I'm a consultant, and I also run the Food Leadership Group as well as the Food Safety Foundation. And the foundation is a group, it's a forum where people can get together and discuss food safety. Because one of the things that we know in quality assurance and legal is that food safety is something that is not proprietary to your company. If one industry is impacted, it impacts all of the players in that field. So if a large ice cream manufacturer has a big recall, everybody who makes ice cream is impacted by that in the minds of the consumer. So it pays to work with other people in the food safety industry to make things better. And that's part of the reason why I founded the foundation, and it's why we're doing these live streams on Fridays. And with this, what you'll notice if you're new to this as well is this is not a presentation. This is a discussion, right? We're talking about the relevant issues of the day. And I'm fortunate enough to know people like Shawn who are experts that I can bring on the show here and talk with you, and you can ask him questions and really get some valuable information to help your food safety and quality systems move forward as well. So Shawn, if you kind of introduce yourself, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a food safety consultant and lawyer. I founded Food Industry Counsel in 2014 after working exclusively with the food industry as a regulatory and trial attorney for the past 2 decades. And we represent food companies exclusively, both in the crisis types of issues when companies are faced with a potential recall or action against their products, and the routine, whether it's routine regulatory compliance or things like labeling or programs and audits and things like that. So we kind of touch a whole bunch of stuff in the food safety space, and it's really great to see what you're doing, Bryan, for the industry. I know you do great work for the industry, and it's really fabulous to collaborate with experts like you to talk about some of the most pressing issues that we're all facing.
Absolutely. And one of the things, Shawn, that when I talk with companies, I'm helping develop their food safety programs and things like that, is there's oftentimes a lot of confusion within companies about the legal aspect. And a lot of companies, once they reach a certain size, they have an in-house counsel and this type of things. Those lawyers generally deal with human resource issues, contracts, the operation of the company, and they don't understand that they also need a food safety lawyer. And that's what Shawn does. And you have to set that up in advance, because if something happens within the company, you have to have a relationship with someone like Shawn in the Food Industry Council who knows food law and can act as that. It's almost like a sounding board, right? And helping guide the company through, and a lot of times, different crises and things like this. And if you're doing it correctly, you can use food lawyers to help avoid those in the first place. And so if you pull one thing out of the conversation here from this morning, is have a food lawyer. Definitely.
Bryan, I would just say we view ourselves as a bookshelf on our clients, or a book on our clients' bookshelves in their office. We're relationship based. We may not speak with a client for 9 months, but suddenly one morning they come to the office and there's an issue that needs a legal issue, a regulatory issue that needs a response quick. We may talk for 15 minutes and not speak again for 6 months. So yeah, I think you're right. Having the strong consulting resources like yourself, and on the legal side, the added support when needed is a really good strategy.
Yep, you have to have that relationship. So if something does happen, because as we were talking about when we were getting ready for this call, it always happens at the wrong time, right? It's Christmas Eve at 3 p.m. and you get the problem, right? You need to be able to pick up that phone and call someone like Shawn. So definitely reach out and build those relationships. Yaslin, good morning. Good to see you. Renee, my friend. Renee is on my team. It's always good to have Renee here. Bryan, of course, out in San Diego. Bryan, former FDA, going again back to the expertise. Bryan is a huge expert in seafood. So glad to have Bryan here. Austin was the person I met for lunch yesterday. He lives in the Denver area as well. Fascinating what he does around communication within companies and how to build your training. And he's really got a unique approach. And we're actually going to have Austin on the show on September 10th. And so really looking forward to that. Jennifer, nice to see you. Kim, wow, I got some new faces here. This is great. And our Jill Stuber, always happy to have Jill here. And one of the things, Shawn, that I always want to jump in right away and get to the topics. But before we do that, everybody, we need to have our beverage of choice drink together here in the morning. Of course, I've got coffee. And everybody join Shawn and myself for the morning drink. Cheers.
It's not a whiskey and Coke. It's Kool-Aid. Great Kool-Aid.
Great Kool-Aid. I love it. I haven't had Kool-Aid in I don't know how long. That's awesome.
Well, in fairness, I think it's Crystal Light because there's no sugar.
There you go. Yeah, definitely. That's something that I try and do too. Is keep the sugar down in the diet. It's a hard thing to do, and especially with COVID and everything else, right? You kind of watch your weight going up, and it's like, oh, geez, got to get back on track now. So we've got a ton of information here to cover today, and at the end of this as well too is Shawn is going to give us a demo for a tool he has developed with his team, which is groundbreaking, right? It's one of those things that we've needed in the industry forever. And you're going to see it and go, holy crap, how did I not have this before? And when you see this, you're going to use it all the time. So really excited to get to that. But first off, we're going to talk about really something that's on everybody's mind right now, and that's food safety culture and how companies develop it and whether you think you have it or not. So what are you kind of thinking around that? What are you seeing out there around food safety culture, Shawn?
Well, let me start by saying I think it's, having been doing this work for over 2 decades, and I call those 2 decades really the food safety revolution. Every year, not a year goes by that we don't see some substantial change that has a significant impact on the direction of the food industry. Whether it's a company having a horrific day or weeks with their product, which has ripple effects through the whole industry, as you noted earlier in the introduction, or whether it's a change in the law or change in FDA policy or USDA approach. So what we're now seeing is this infusing of culture and the conversation of culture and a discussion of culture by a whole lot of folks. Within the food industry, people are talking about culture. Within companies, people are talking about culture. And we're not just the only ones who care. Beginning, yesterday or not too long ago, FDA cares about culture, DOJ cares about culture, USDA cares about culture, and so does GFSI. And I do predict as we move forward, there's some very kind of forward-thinking thought leaders currently in the agency who are looking for new, better, and more creative approaches to enhancing the safety of the food that's distributed in commerce. And what was FSMA? When you think about it, when it was passed in 2011, and eventually the rules came on board, FSMA was Congress telling the FDA, make foodborne illness stop. Make it stop. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. Oh, and by the way, throw in foreign materials, undeclared, mislabeling, undeclared allergens and chemicals, right? And that's what the agency said. So now what we're seeing is the agency looking for different tools that it can use to ensure that it's executing on what it was told to do. So, folks like Frank Yanis within the agency right now, he wrote a book on culture, right? He understands the importance of culture within an organization. And culture, the difficulty I think that we find with culture is we begin to predict what this will look like when FDA begins to regulate culture, and it will be regulated. We're seeing 483s being issued to companies now that state, as a violation of law, federal law, this company has no food safety culture, right?
Wow.
Well, what does that mean? Can I prosecute somebody for not having a good culture? Well, probably not per se, but you sure can look for other doctrines like the Park Doctrine that could come into play when there is no culture. We can talk a little bit about that in just a little bit. But I think, as we sort of struggle to figure out, okay, well, what is culture? GFSI has, some thoughts on it. FDA is actively discussing it internally. And the challenge that we're trying to overcome is, and this is from my perspective, there's always been a disconnect between the C-suite and the regulatory folks, the food safety folks, right? We're not, food safety doesn't necessarily immediately translate to profits. It's a cost center. It costs the company money. And, if the CEO is being told, hey, there's a risk that we don't, replace this equipment for $1 million or $10 million, and that we're going to have a listeria outbreak, and the CEO says, well, what's the risk to me? It's, I don't know, 1%. Well, maybe he or she rolls the dice because 1% isn't a big risk, and he doesn't or she doesn't want to spend $1 million.
Yeah.
And that's a decision that's reflective of the kind of a poor food safety culture, because the risk is there. It's been quantified, and 1% might seem small, but that's 1 out of every hamburger buns you produce today, right? So I think we need to find a way to bridge this disconnect. And a lot of companies, unfortunately, another challenge is that they think the C-suite or the leadership believes mistakenly that they have a really good culture, when in fact they don't, right? How many folks in the corporations that you and I have worked for have said, at least early on in our relationships, we've got a great food safety programs, we've got great resources, we spend so much money on food safety, and we have an amazing culture. And we kind of look around, and maybe it kind of feels like that, or maybe it doesn't. But then when push comes to shove, and that order from the customer comes in, and it exceeds production capacity, they say, well, we're going to shrink sanitation. We're going to extend our hours. We're going to be pushing a greater volume of product down that line, and they put pressures on the system and create risk, right? And those are the organizations that have purport to have this really great culture. So, you look in 2018, there was almost 850 recalls that year. I can guarantee you each and every one of those 820 companies would tell you and I, if they were on this call, that they have a fabulous food safety culture. And I think if in fact they did, maybe that number of recalls would have dropped from 850 to 450, right? So I think we need to bridge that gap. And, people are beginning to talk about how do we measure food safety culture? And I'll throw this question back to you, Bryan, because I'm interested in your perspective, or anybody on this call. Some people will say aptly, a culture, food safety culture in an organization is what people are doing when nobody's looking.
Yeah.
And that's true. But the problem with that is we don't know what they're doing if we're not looking, right? So we can't really gauge or quantify it. The other, I've heard, and this, I think there's a great deal of merit to this. John Butts said recently, there is an objective measure to food safety culture. And if we're looking, for example, that a company that has a risk in its products with listeria in its environment, it's the period of time that you allow a strain of listeria to persist in your environment. Now, I've worked with clients who have had listeria, and now that we're moving to strain typing, which we can talk about a little bit later, who have had the same strain for a year and a half,
Yeah.
and even longer when FDA comes, finds it during visit A. They show up 9 months later, they find the same strain in visit B, and they're coming back 6 months later, and it's still there. Well, that is, as elusive as listeria is, he's right. Because if we're not doing enough to eliminate those strains from our environment, we don't have the right culture in our facility, because that means we're not willing to slow production. We're not willing to disassemble equipment. We're not willing to take a day off because we're just pushing product out the door. So, and not investing enough resources to investigating and eliminating. So those are sort of my two. What's yours? Is there any, as you think about this, any gauges you might add to the mix and how we could quantify culture?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, isn't it? Because part of it's kind of like art, right? I don't know much about art, but I know what I like, right? And people can kind of look at that and see type things, right? So one of the things from a culture standpoint is that I look for is quality beyond just the quality department, right? You'll see this in plants. There's an issue. Say, oh, we had a quality problem. It's like, really? Well, last I checked, quality doesn't make any product. Right? We had an operational problem and quality detected it. So part of that is in a production facility and within the company at the higher level, right? Is when you talk quality, is everybody involved? Is it the operations manager and the maintenance manager and the procurement manager and the plant manager? And you have this big conversation around quality and everybody has input in it. Because Shawn, one of those things that's really unique about quality is that it's not limited to one particular function. If you're in operations, right, you want to produce product and get it out, as you were talking about, to the customers and meet those orders on time, in spec and all those type of things that they're measured on. But quality is that group that's kind of setting the overall framework. And at the corporate level, I think, and this is just my personal experience, but it seems like a lot of times, Shawn, the person who becomes CEO within a company didn't come up necessarily through that channel. They don't understand it. A lot of times the CEO comes from sales, they come from marketing, they come from finance. They've been in corporate their entire lives. They haven't been out to the plants. And when they go to the plants, it's a special occasion, right? The plant gussies everything up, makes it look really nice. The CEO gets the tour and that's it, right? He walks away and says, oh yeah, we're doing good. We're doing good, right? They don't see the small indicators, right? And it's kind of one of those things, like you were talking about when you're cutting corners because you have a lot of production. A lot of ways, these type of failures in the culture are additive, right? It's okay, we're willing to cut corners on sanitation and we're willing to do this and we're willing, and all these little things add up to those failures where then that risk formula gets to the point where there's an issue and then everybody goes, oh, why did this happen, right? Well, it's kind of the logical result.
Yeah, you make a great point about the the CEO or other leadership coming from non-food or food science or food safety backgrounds. You may have had a great CEO who was doing a fabulous job at a paint company, pushing paint out the door, but doesn't know a thing about food safety. Mm-hmm. And I'll just, this is Shawn's, I would say, very strong opinion developed over 20 years of representing food companies in crisis scenarios, including those where their products were alleged to have made lots of people sick or even killed some people. And I spent a lot of my career doing that defense work. And each of those companies, in each of those instances did believe, in fact, they had a strong culture. But in some cases they did. In other cases, it was on its way. It wasn't there yet. But still, it wasn't enough to prevent, disaster from happening. So, part of what I've been trying to do over the course of my career is look for those areas where maybe we could be doing a better job as an industry. And one of them is, and I characterize it as, we need to change the way we speak when we talk about risks in food. And I think it's really super important, because when that CEO comes from the paint company and is, hearing secondhand that there's some intermittent findings of listeria on the facility floor, He or she then perhaps they flag the director of food safety up to their office for a 5-minute meeting and says, "What's this? I'm hearing about listeria." And the director of food safety, who was trained in the 1990s or the early 2000s or even more recently, comes in and says, "Well, this is a legacy facility. Listeria is everywhere. It's in all food facilities. We expect to find it in the environment. If we're not finding it, then there's a problem." Mm-hmm. So it's supposed to be there, in essence, what we're saying. And, it's okay because our findings were just in the drains or in a zone 3 area, nowhere, near, it wasn't on any food contact surfaces. Well, probably because we aren't sampling food contact surfaces. But then the CEO says, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Keep up the great work." Uh-huh. Director of food safety feels good. CEO feels good. And meanwhile, these intermittent findings continue to persist over weeks, months, in some cases, years. And they, in many cases, will contaminate food products, large amounts of food products over large periods of time, intermittently. And, we see that with all of the more recent recalls involving pathogens. It's large amounts of product being produced over long periods of time that are intermittently contaminated with a single strain or multiple strains of a pathogen. And Listeria has been sort of at the forefront of that. And why is that? It is because we have been teaching ourselves, and I taught myself, and I argued this to juries, Bryan, that Listeria is in the environment and we're supposed to find it. And FDA tells us we're supposed to find it. But what's happened is I think we've become resigned. So when it is there, there's no urgency. Okay, fine. Yeah, we'll get around to, replacing that piece of equipment, in our next fiscal year. Mm-hmm. Or we'll give you a little extra money for a little extra sampling so that you can maybe try to track down the real source. And in many cases, getting to the real source requires some work. Mm-hmm. And disruptions in production, which nobody's willing to do when they're being told that, Listeria is supposed to be in our processing environment. And I'll tell you from my experience, whether it's a camera above a salad line, intermittently spraying Listeria on packaged salads over the course of 6 months, or intermittent findings of Listeria in an ice cream facility that, if you call it outbreak, caused, 9 illnesses over the course of 5 years. These are examples of very sophisticated companies who just kind of looked at Listeria as a routine. Mm-hmm. And it's just to be expected. So my plea to this audience and to you and to everybody I have an opportunity to speak to is let's start working on changing the way we speak. And when we teach ourselves and we teach our leadership, when there's Listeria in the drain, the alarms should be going off. The smoke detector is going off, okay? Yeah. And we need to find out where the smoke is coming from and put it out. Because if we don't, eventually if we ignore those fire alarms, and we keep getting a few every month or more, and we just kind of, nonchalantly look the other way, eventually one of those is going to turn into a fire. So right. That's kind of my perspective when it comes to, and that then rolls into culture, because if we're speaking to the C-suite that way and we're saying, hey, this is a problem, this is urgent, and then the next question is why? Well, because if it's in the drain, it can get on the food. It can get on the zone 1 food contact surfaces. Maybe we should sample zone 1 food contact surfaces. Well, no, we don't want to do that because we're going to find it and then we're going to have to recall food or hold it, right? Right. Okay, so we appreciate the risk now that it could be there because we're not sampling, but we need to go after it if we're not sampling zone 1 more aggressively, and we have to talk about the consequences. And the consequences, that's a frank conversation. I'll tell you, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of leadership teams and companies. It used to be in boardrooms. Now it's on calls like this. And a lot of them I'll do on my dime, where you just have a frank conversation for an hour about what the current status of the industry is with respect to FDA enforcement, what they're doing, where they're looking, where companies have made mistakes, where companies have gotten really in trouble with the agency because of enhanced regulatory actions and or DOJ involvement. And a lot of those clients will still today say to me, "Hey, Shawn, I'm really glad we had those conversations because I don't look good in orange, and I never want to." And I think we need to understand and appreciate in this broader context of culture. We got to be compassionate about food safety, but we also have to understand the consequences of having a not investing entirely and wholeheartedly in a culture.
Right. And wow, there's a ton to unpack there, right? Because part of this is human nature, Shawn. If you're in charge of food safety within a company and you're following this, and hey, I grew up and I developed my programs in the 90s as well, right? So I've been brought up in this model. And when the CEO comes to you and says, "Hey, Bryan, everything okay?" What are you going to say, right? It's human nature to say, "Hey, boss, I got it here, doing a good job," right? And he goes, "Okay, fine," right? And he moves along his way. From a human nature standpoint, people aren't going to say, "Oh my God," right? I'm doing a really terrible job here. There's listeria in the environment. I can't get rid of it. And geez, what am I doing wrong, right? Your boss isn't going to have much confidence in you if you do that, right? So you have to. And I think your point here is really, really good in that you have to be able to change that conversation and say, "Hey, listen, boss, right? We need to have a new conversation around environmental monitoring because the way we used to do things doesn't work anymore." And by the way, FDA has changed how they're doing that as well. Let's take a look at some of the comments here real quick. So Jill had a couple comments here around risk is based on occurrence, right? Doesn't take into account severity of failure or ability to detect the failure. That's a good point, right? You're only seeing the failures you see, right? What else is going on behind the scenes? I like your smoke detector analogy with that, right? So the alarm is going off. What else is happening? And how do we bring this in with quality tools like failure mode effect analysis, FEMA? So that's huge in the automotive industry, right? What's the severity? What's the likelihood? We saw some of this around food fraud and Carver shock analysis and these type of things is looking at that. Austin had a comment here as well, Shawn. So you can also look into reward structures. What gets rewarded gets done. If the reward structure is solely based on production matrix as opposed to safety, that might raise some red flags. Absolutely. One of the things that I've noted in my career is problems always happen at the wrong time. And people are like, "Oh my God, why is this happening now? We have this big order that we need to get out and blah, blah, blah." And my response back is, well, of course it happens now. To your point, Shawn, this is when you cut corners. This is when you don't clean as well. This is when people are tired, right? You're trying to get the product out the door and everybody is focused on that one agenda. And that's when problems happen.
Yep.
Kim had a comment here. Welcome, Kim. Creating a culture of cleanliness allows employees to take a break to wash their hands and not feel the pressure of orders coming in. Coming out of the pandemic, guests are more sympathetic for those breaks to allow a safer guest/employee experience. 100%, right? One of the things, when you walk into a production facility, if it's clean and it's organized and there's a flow to it, that's a huge impression, right? If you go in and there's clutter everywhere and you look around and there's stuff stacked in the corners and stuff like that, big red flag. It's just like in your home, right? You have to have a clean home. Austin mentioned communication. There are channels in place for the front line to report or take action, right? Are there things in place like that? One of the things in plants, and this kind of gets into the culture elements, is what's going on behind the scenes, right? So if an employee goes to their supervisor, says, hey, boss, I just saw something that's not right. And they go, just keep running, right? Because that's his instructions. That employee very quickly after the second or third time understands, okay, there's no point saying anything. Nothing's going to happen, right? So they shut up, right? And those
Yep.
And yeah, so the environmental piece is huge, right? And so I love how you're linking that with culture. That's an indicator of what's going on, right? If you have a problem that doesn't go away, if you have environmental issues, if you keep having allergen recalls, these type of things, that means there's a systemic problem going on and you're not eradicating the issue. And one of the things on the environmental monitoring side is FDA has changed their approach radically. And what you're talking about right now is how FDA is handling environmental monitoring. So everybody, if you haven't read it, FDA, you can Google this online. FDA has an inspections operations manual, the IOM. And in 2021, Shawn, they updated that. And in chapter 4, on page 25, they start talking about environmental monitoring. and how they approach it, right? So we've all heard about these swabathons, and when FDA comes in to do this, and their approach is exactly what you're talking about. They are ignoring, for the most part, zones 4 and 3, right? So zone 4 traditionally drains, walls, things that aren't in contact with the food, things that we've focused on in the industry. 3, indirect surfaces. They're actually sampling now almost exclusively from zone 1 and zone 2. Zone 1, direct product contact surfaces. Zone 2, indirect product contact surfaces. So think something next to a belt, or think of buttons, right? Machines that they hit those buttons and then they touch the line, and they hit the buttons and they touch the line. Those are the things that FDA is sampling. And if you're not doing that, you're at a huge, huge disadvantage.
And interestingly, Bryan, I saw that FDA will further, in addition to what you've described, treat in small processing rooms, the entire room is a zone 2.
Yeah.
Which is a huge reinterpretation of what zone 2 was conceived to be and is supposed to be. So, a zone 2 sample in a small processing room in the far corner, far away from any handling of food. Well, that sounds a lot worse than it really is on the ground. So there's added risk everywhere, and I think we chatted about this briefly yesterday. If anybody knows of people who like to hunt, being from Wisconsin, almost everybody here does. I don't personally, but the one thing that hunters want to do when they go out, or I suppose people who fish, is catch something, right? Yeah. And bag that game and shake them out of the bushes. So when FDA is going out and looking for listeria, for example, these are FDA listeria hunters, and their goal, and they're satisfied. Now, they're satisfied if they don't find anything, because it demonstrates that the environmental monitoring program and the sanitation program works, and there's safe food going out. But we're all human beings, right? To your point about psychology, they want to find something, and they're looking in the hardest to clean and the hardest to sanitize places, and they're bound and determined to find it if, in fact, it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so as part of that, right, we need to take the blinders off, because part of this is, okay, I'm only going to look for Listeria species. I'm not going to take it any farther. That's all I need to know, Well, guess what? That doesn't work anymore, right? When FDA goes in and samples, they're typing that stuff out, right? They're looking at and figuring out exactly what you have. And to your point earlier, Shawn, if they come back a year later and they find that same strain of Listeria monocytogenes in your drain, you're in trouble, right? They're going to say, you're not doing a good job.
You're approaching warning area territory.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
3 strikes and you're out. It used to, I think it's moving towards 2.
Yeah. So part of this is, and this is something that I hammer quite a bit, and this applies to your field very much as well too, right? Is the technical skills that we develop in what we do in food safety and food quality and law and things like this are important, and we need to have that skill set. But if you don't communicate that information and you don't manage up within the organization and teach other people about food safety, you can't build that culture, right? So the procurement people need to talk about food safety. The R&D people, the operations, the maintenance team, the C-suite, all these people need to understand what it is that you're talking about, right? This is just not your domain. This is something that the company needs to embrace.
So I have a couple of final thoughts on winning the war against pathogens and for food safety culture. The first is, always ask ourselves, when are we sampling, Bryan? Too many companies sample immediately after, pre-op or after cleaning and sanitization, and the results are meaningless. It's got to be, well into production, 4 or 5 hours. I'm a firm believer of that. And then on the non-routine, play FDA for a day. I strongly advise, if you want to know what FDA is going to find when it shows up in your facility, and they are going to be showing up, the Listeria hunters were on leave for too long and they're anxious to get back out in the field. Play FDA for a day. And I strongly advise companies completely outside of their existing food safety programs, go in, collect 100 swabs from your zone, threes and twos. We stay away from ones, and see what we have. Do it 5 hours in production and see exactly what FDA would find, and look into places where you might be a little worried about. We do that with a lot of clients under the attorney-client privilege. We'll open an account with the lab, the reports will be sent to us, and then we'll share it with the company. So it falls under, those privileges. So nobody will ever see it. But then if, we're seeing, oh my God, we got 3 or 4 positives, we can address those, right? Because we didn't detect them in our routine program. Number 3, use strain typing. We can't defeat an enemy if we don't know whether it's an enemy or what uniform it's wearing, right? So if I'm seeing Listeria intermittently and I'm not doing strain typing, it's very easy for me to conclude that, well, this may just, I'm a little lazy today. It's Friday. I want to go home for the long weekend. I'm just going to say that this is a transient strain and it appeared and it's gone. But we keep intermittently finding them. So are they transient or are they resident? Well, if we do strain typing, I have a lot of clients that use ribotyping. It's relatively inexpensive. FDA does not recognize it because it's moved off of that technology towards WGS. So it doesn't have any legal consequence whatsoever. We do that under the attorney-client privilege as well. We get to see, okay, we defeated this strain. Or if we get a new strain after 9 months of nothing and it's the same one we had before, we know it's back. Or we can conclude if it wasn't the same as anything before, it likely is transient. But we can begin, right, map out where these different A, B, and C are and destroy them. And then number 4, which you mentioned, is reporting. I think every company needs a system where the QA or the regulatory folks are required to send at least a weekly report to the C-suite that says, these are our Listeria findings, these are where they are, this is our recommendation and responding to it. Because if they're not hearing about it, they're not going to do anything. They're going to assume they're in a position where they can say, I delegated that to my food safety folks, and it's their responsibility. That's not my wheelhouse. Well, with the PARC doctrine, DOJ says otherwise. If you're in a position to oversee someone, and there's in a position to fix a problem, and there's a condition that could lead to product contamination, it doesn't get fixed, you could be criminally liable. So we got to be reporting that information to the C-suite so they can hear it, they can see it, they can appreciate the significance, and then they can act on it.
Right, and that's part of that conversation. That's why a good food safety lawyer is worth their weight in gold, because they can help you with that conversation. Because the C-suite needs to understand they can't pass that off and say, not my problem.
And we do it in a very non-offensive way. It's very professional. And we're all friends, right? Because we're all trying to avoid the risks that are out there. So what are the risks, and where might we be exposed, and how can we do a little more to make sure that we're protecting the brand and we're protecting ourselves? Because we're all, at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, and we all want to do a great job.
Absolutely. And part of what I think people need to realize too, and this kind of circles back to earlier in our conversation, Shawn, is that it's just not your company, right? It's the industry, and it's your particular segment of what you're working in. And getting that information on what's going on in the industry and what is FDA going after has been really hard to figure out. Because if anybody here has gone to FDA's website and you look up recalls, it's really hard to analyze that data. You can take a snapshot and you can pull it offline and you can play with it and go through it. But who's got time to do that, right? So it's really, really hard. And so one of the things that I'm really excited to show people here today is this new tool that you've developed, which is available on your site. So I'm gonna pull that up now, and we'll show everybody this. And if you can walk people through here, Shawn, I would appreciate it.
Yes, of course. So so this is something that this is very near and dear to our hearts. Been working on this for just about 5 years. And what we did is, because, and mostly because I think I'm a nerd, I really get into recalls, and I wanted to kind of see what was happening, on a daily basis. So I began, me and my colleague began putting together, basically pulling all of the recall data from USDA and FDA and putting it into basically spreadsheets. And then decided, as the years kind of grew and we were accumulating more data, that it would be great to create a dashboard where the industry could actually access this information. And this is This is 100%, cost us a lot of money to make it, but I'll tell you, it's 100% available to industry. Food safety is not competitive. There's no cost. It's a resource that's free, and it's available to whoever is a nerd like me. The address is foodindustry.com/recalls.
Yep, I put the link in the chat.
Perfect. Okay, great. So basically, in addition to assembling all the data since the year 2000, we also categorize the data in such a way that it would be really helpful to food industry folks who are looking to answer questions about either food companies or the risk associated with products or recalls that have happened in the past. So if you look at the reporter here, we've got the search bar. And then this just when you're on the landing page, this just lists the most recent recalls. So we see August 16th, 2001, Hostess had a recall for Listeria and Salmonella and some hamburger buns. Here's a detail page that we've created, and then there's a link to the actual recall announcement.
Beautiful.
Yeah, this includes, just by way of example, so this includes all Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 recalls. You'll note that FDA doesn't often publish or provide any public notification for Class 2 and Class 3 recalls, other than the weekly enforcement reports, which sometimes aren't updated until months or even years after a recall was announced. So all that data has been captured and now exists and resides in this database. And it's updated daily. So this will always reflect, a near real-time list or data set of all the recalls that have occurred. Now, there's some very useful things we can do with the database to help us professionally, but there's some fun things as well. So if I wanted to know how many recalls there have been in the last 20 years for, let's say, a fingertip issue, I see there's been 2. October 3rd, 2016, here's the company. There's a fingertip found in cinnamon rolls and a donut. A little bit further back, on April 1st, 2005, this company found a fingertip. Somebody found a fingertip in their potato scrambled breakfast.
Ew.
I'll bet everybody scrambled from the breakfast table when they found the finger.
Oh man.
Let's say you just had an issue with hydraulic fuel, and you're wondering if there's been any recalls for hydraulic fluid or what the agency might do. Well, we see, look at this. There was one in 2005. I was actually involved in that one. In 2021, we see one recently, just within the last few months, involving hydraulic fluid. And it tells us, and if we look over to the side here, we also classify the recalls. So which one was a Class 1 is 2005. This one more recently in 2021 was a Class 2. So there likely wasn't any public notification. We could take a look.
Interesting. Does anybody have any suggestions for Shawn on what you'd like him to search to show the tool? Because if I'm in industry, how am I going to use this, right? So part of this is breaking through. So part of human nature is the belief that if something hasn't happened, it won't happen. And as a food safety professional, you need to break through that. I use the phrasing, it never happened to us before, right? So the unspoken part is it never will. And part of this then, Shawn, is you can go out and look at people who are in your space and compare and see what type of problems and recalls they've had. And then you can use that ammunition to show to the C-suite and the executives that, yeah, people in our industry have had very similar problems to what I'm talking about. It can happen to us if we don't make it not happen to us, right?
Sure. Yep. And I don't want to pick on any names, but you could, insert common household names, companies that produce, sophisticated companies that produce a lot of food. And you'll see, in some cases, a long list of recalls that they've been involved with. You can also, and a lot of food industry folks are using this now when they're vetting suppliers. So if I want to, know if, the Acme company, and I just say it Acme because it's sort of a generic name, has ever had any recalls. Boom, I type in Acme and I can see, this particular company had a recall in, 2020. Is that the supplier that I'm looking to partner with? And, oh, you know what? It was an issue that, wasn't too large or wasn't too big, or maybe I have a question for them to make sure that, those issues aren't going to persist.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they had a recall more recently that I'm interested in. I did cinnamon because what if I'm going to source cinnamon for my product and I just don't know what risks are associated with that product, and I'm trying to do my hazard analysis? I can say, okay, what type of, cinnamon products were recalled and for what? Here we see salmonella in 2020. Couple of those. We see a lot of issues with allergens. So you can scroll down. You can also, if we're doing a search for chocolate, we're going to get a lot of products, but also companies who have chocolate in their name. Here's Lake Chaplin chocolate. So what we can do is we can use these little boxes down here to limit it to the company, and it'll just give us the name, the companies with chocolate in their name, or we could limit it to brand, where chocolate's in the brand, or we could limit it to products. And now we're just looking at where chocolate appears in the product. Then on the recall class side, we can say, okay, well, there's been 201 recalls, class 1 recalls, 219 class 2, 19 class 3, and non-published 123. FDA doesn't always publish the recall classification. I'm guessing it's usually going to be in those instances where it's, kind of class 3, or maybe even they determined it was a stock recovery or market withdrawal. Yeah. So we're going to always see some of those. But what if I just want to look at the class 1s? So I now only see class 1 recalls. They're all FDA. And I want to look at only those that dealt with Listeria monocytogenes. So I get to click on that. And then here's all the recalls in since the last 2 decades involving Listeria in a chocolate product that was recalled. And I've got 13 here, and I can scroll through and see, okay, what were the products and what was the risk? So nice. The database is incredibly useful. I've also, I've been on the call with clients who say, hey, for instance, my waffles are really low risk. And I can say within seconds, well, they may be, but there's been 32 recalls in the last 20 years involving, some type of waffle product, either waffle themselves or waffle mixes. Mm-hmm. So it's, as you can see, it's incredibly powerful and instant if you're trying to pull data from the problems that companies have had and what the nature of those problems were. And I'm going to show you a chart in just a few minutes, but I created it by doing this. I'm just going to reset this really quick. So let's see, let's go 2018. Refresh. Okay. 2018. I now see all the recalls from 2018. There were 714. And then here I can see how many class 1, how many class 2, how many class 3. I can look and see how many, were for non-declared milk, tree nuts, wheat, soy, how many were for salmonella and all of these other pathogens, or for other reasons. A few here in 2018 for the findings of blood in the product, right? Or insects. We've also found it very useful when, for instance, we may have a client, or you yourself may be faced with, oh my goodness, we have we found some pesticide residue in our product. How do you think FDA would treat that? Have there been any recalls dealing with that residue? And if there haven't, it's just a data point that helps to say, okay, maybe this is one that the agency doesn't look quite as seriously at. Or if there is, maybe it was a class 3 and it was no big deal. And we can then, when we're dealing with the recall coordinator at the FDA, we can sort of characterize this as it should be a class 3, so we can avoid having to do the public notification if we really think there isn't any risk here. So feel free to jump into this. Play around. Like I said, it's all the class 1, 2, and 3 recalls from 2000. We try to set it up in a way that was easy to navigate and easy to use. You can do risk assessments for products. You can do risk assessments for ingredients, and you can do risk assessments for suppliers. when you search for them by name. And I think what I'd like to do, if we can, is
well, tell you what, a couple quick points on that you said them so fast. I want to make sure people understand. Is use this for your suppliers, right? You're looking to bring on a new supplier for an ingredient. You can do a search on this for the ingredients and see what type of recalls have been involved with those ingredients. You can do a search for that supplier to see if they've been involved in recalls, right? Super powerful tool here.
Yep. And I can tell you, I'm going to echo your point, Brian, as another tool for the C-suite. I do see the FDA beginning to issue warning letters to those companies that have had a large number of recalls in a relatively few short amount of years. So, it's possible if they're not doing it themselves internally, you can do it here and say, listen, if we end up like one of these companies that have had multiple recalls for a common issue, that could be grounds for a warning letter without the FDA even showing up in our facility. So we can leverage this data in a lot of really different in useful ways. I think that'll be helpful.
No, definitely. And so a couple of points on that too, right, is we're looking at it, but also FDA and USDA can use this tool, right? So they're using this to look at companies and deciding what they need to do.
Yeah, we currently have, in addition to a whole slew of food industry companies that are visiting the site routinely, I'd say at least a couple dozen different people from FDA who have routinely been on the website and are visiting near daily, as well as from the Department of Health and Human Services, probably food affiliated, and as well as a lot of activity from within the USDA. So the agencies are also finding this tool to be incredibly useful, I think, in whether crunching data or just maybe they're nerds like me and they like to, look at this stuff.
Well, no, absolutely. And that's good, right? It helps the conversation because they're seeing what we're seeing, and then we can work off of a common framework. Another point that people may not realize, Shawn, that you brought up is that the classification of the recall is determined by FDA, right? So if you have an issue, you then communicate that to FDA, reportable food registry, these type of things, and then a discussion begins. And FDA and the recall coordinator will figure out what's the risk to public health. And then they're going to categorize it accordingly. That's not you, that's them. And having that information to talk with FDA about that classification is very powerful.
Oh my goodness. So there's been multiple occasions when we've had a client dealing with an FDA recall coordinator. We've said to the coordinator, listen, based on all of these factors, we believe that this should be characterized as a class 2 or a class 3. The recall coordinator has come back and said, no, I think I'm going to recommend a class 1. And we've pushed back, and I've actually provided 5 links to the recall coordinator directly to our detail page that says, here are the exact 5 same recalls that occurred in the last 2 years, and they've all been characterized as class 2. This should be a class 2. And I'll tell you, they changed their recommendation like that. So it's incredibly powerful on so many different levels.
Absolutely. So there was a graph you wanted to share as well too. So let's.
Yeah, if I could. So I'm just going to stop sharing this screen here.
Yeah. While you're pulling that up, I'll answer a couple of questions here. So thanks for the positive comments, Elise. Really appreciate it. Austin had a comment here relative to, do we have any data on the cost of a recall? Now, a lot of times companies don't share that information, but from what we do know, the average cost of a recall is $30 million. Which is amazing.
Yep. I would say that those numbers that is a true average, probably skewed by some of the very, much larger companies, who are going to see recalls that are in the range of sometimes $50 to $60 million, if not more. Mm-hmm. And what I tell our clients is, when you're thinking about recall insurance, first think about it. Number 2, get it. And number 3, we can predict what level of insurance you need and what your recall is going to cost by looking at sort of your worst case batch scenario or lot scenario,
right?
And then maybe adding on some buffers. But that number could be 1 million, it could be 6 million, it could be 12 million, right? So all important things to be thinking about. Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely. So let's pull up your graph here. There we go. Beautiful. So what are we looking at here, Shawn?
Yeah. So this is just, so I took our reporter and I just typed in each year. It started at 2003. Before 2003, we go back to 2000 itself on FDA side, but USDA data begins to get a little bit fuzzy. And this tracks the total. So I just, it was easy. 2003, how many recalls? How many were FDA? How many were USDA? How many were in total, right? It took me about 15 minutes to put this together. It would have taken me 6 months, not longer, if I was trying to do it from the FDA and USDA websites, but and enforcement reports. But what we see here is 2003, we were only seeing 298 recalls. And, as we talk about this food safety revolution over the course of the last 2 decades, this kind of reflects the trajectory we've been on with, new crises in the industry and new regulations and new policies and new enforcement tools. We see this massive spike. USDA, how impressive, only 34 recalls in 2006. Now, granted, there's far fewer USDA regulated food facilities and FDA regulated facilities, but those are some good numbers when compared to later on in the like 2015, 16, and even 17. But we see this massive spike in the year 2009. What happened? Well, I'm sure remember Peanut Corporation of America. That drove us all the way up to 749 total recalls. 682 of those were caused by FDA products. And what you'll see is the FDA really is a driver of recalls when we look at the total numbers. Yeah. The total numbers really track what FDA is doing. Interestingly, some of the peaks and valleys, kind of follow both USDA and FDA. I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for that. But then we dropped back down to 313 recalls in 2010. And that's when everybody, I think FDA was still kind of doing business like it was, and everybody was scrambling and saying, what are we going to do to prevent a PCA, to prevent foodborne illness outbreaks, to prevent these types of issues? And lo and behold, in 2011, we had the passage of FSMA signed into law. And suddenly the FDA had new powers, it had new authority, it had a new mission, and it had new incentive to go out there and make foodborne illnesses stop and prevent all other food safety issues. So our recalls jumped up to 715, back down a little bit in 13 to 566, probably because almost everybody in the agency was working on drafting the final rules. Remember, there was a lot of pressure on the agency to get those rules out. Oh, yeah. And then as the rules start to come out, 14, we see the numbers really start to increase and skyrocket again, 774 and 15 in 2016, they're 820. Well, what happened between 14 and 18? What happened? Well, the FDA swabathon is what happened. And FDA going into food facilities and conducting far more inspections than it was in the past and taking far more samples. In fact, it wasn't really taking any samples in the past. And we saw this correlation in the spike of recalls. And then, of course, now, as we enter the year of COVID, 2020, we saw only 420. I think if I look at my numbers here, we've got like 295 so far this year, which puts us on a trajectory to about 450 total. FDA recalls next year. So there's a little bump, but I'm going to tell you, when we talk about the pendulum of recalls, what goes up must come down, and what goes down must and will go up. And we're at such a low right now at 420. To my friends in the industry, I predict, if not next year, very soon thereafter, we're going to be jumping up again and likely exceeding those 820 numbers. So this is now the time before FDA arrives in our facilities to make sure your sampling program is right, to do your FDA for a day, to do strain typing, and make sure that when FDA shows up in your facility to find what they're looking for, there is nothing to find.
Yeah, absolutely. So get ready. It's coming. So let's see a couple questions here, and then we'll have to kind of bring this back up and close out here. Raphael asked a question. There's a particular segment in the industry that drives more FDA recalls that you've seen. So lettuce, cheese, anything like that. Is there any type of a trend you've noticed so far from looking at the data?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I haven't studied the data with an eye towards what are the most risky commodities. If I could take, FDA's list, and do a search for each of those, I could probably rank them and show you the exact numbers of recalls associated with which one. We're seeing it's the biggest problem right now for the industry is undeclared allergens.
Yeah, and
we're having a hard time getting our head around it. I'm going to just, if I can, I'm going to pull up the recall report. Do you have just a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because I want to kind of do a better job to answer this question. So I'm just going to pull up the recall reporter again. And while we're sitting here, because this is what I do if we were just on the phone. All right, I'm sharing it now. Okay, so the landing screen gives us total recalls, right? We're up about 10,000. Mm-hmm. So what's the leading cause right now? It looks like salmonella in products is the leading cause with 1,723. Right here, we see this number. Looks like second might be undeclared milk with 1,175 in products. So those are undeclared allergens. If we were interested in, the salmonella, we could click into that and just see, okay, what are the list of products here that are accounting for all these recalls? And even we could limit it to just the year 2021. Who's having problems with salmonella in 2021? From hamburger buns to carrots, right? So I think, the higher risk products are always going to be the higher risk, those that are ready to eat. And I'd say that culture and risk are the two things that are really going to drive which products are going to be going to be the worst. Yep. And remember, it used to be ground beef used to be the most dangerous product out there, and there's been hardly any recalls associated with pathogens and ground beef in recent years. So the industry has done a great job.
Good point. So definitely, Raphael, with this tool, right? So what's great about this is you can go in there and play with this and slice and dice this data to get the answer that you're looking for. I would add on to that too, right? One of the big risks within our supply chain is our supply chain, right? It's our suppliers, right? And so a lot of these big spikes that you see were because of an issue with a supplier that impacted all kinds of companies, and they were caught with their pants down. How difficult is it to obtain data that identifies entities that have had class 1, 2, and 3 recalls and have been abandoned in name at least and recreated as a new subsidiary or parent company? That's kind of a weird one. Not a whole lot that I know of, right?
Yeah. You could, if you're interested in a company, you could do maybe a search of the corporate records that would be available at the state level to see what their history was. But the short answer is there is no easy way. I can tell you, at least from my experience, when we were clocking 850 recalls a year, as non-routine as a recall is, they're pretty routine. Customers are used to them. The retailers are used to them. The restaurant chains are used to them. Everybody's used to them. And it's just, we have to deal with it. It's cost of doing business. So it isn't the stigma that gets attached to a company when it recalls a product I don't think, what it used to be.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So amazing conversation. Let's kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level. So we've covered food safety culture. And Maria had a question for more information on that. Our emails are on here. Reach out to either of us. We'd be happy to talk with you about that and give you some ideas, because it's a difficult topic. The importance of environmental monitoring and not doing it the way you used to do it. Go and look at the inspections operation manual, read chapter 4, understand that, and put together and redesign your systems. And use data. Use this amazing database that Shawn and his team have put together. Again, thank you for that. Man, I've already played around with this a ton. It is so easy to use. It's really, really good. And use that data, right, to communicate in your organization. It's not enough just to have the data. You need to take that data and use it to drive change in your organization, because if you don't, it serves no purpose. So use that to manage up, as the saying goes, right? So hopefully this has been helpful today. Any closing thoughts, Shawn, or you'd like to wrap up with? Or
no, this has been a great conversation. I think our conversation should continue on what additional tools we can find and or make available to the industry to give them the tools that they need to approach the C-suite in the way that the C-suite is not only going to listen, but they're going to get it.
Exactly. Perfect closing. So everybody, thank you for joining us. It's amazing. Time flies, Shawn, as we talked about, right? We're over an hour on this conversation. I think this has been the longest one, the longest food safety chat, and we could have gone on for another hour here. So come back next week and join us for the live stream. Again, it's every Friday. So we'll be back here on Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain, 9 a.m. Central, where Shawn's at in beautiful Wisconsin, 10 a.m. Eastern, of course, around the world. And if you have ideas of what you'd like us to talk about in these chats, drop me a note, and I will find experts like Shawn that we can go out there and talk with and bring to you and help you increase your food safety knowledge. So everybody, have a great weekend. Really enjoyed this. Again, this is Bryan with the Food Safety Foundation and Shawn Stevens with the Food Industry Council. And everybody, have a great one. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.